us. Daniel McAdams, he's from RPI, the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. He's going to talk about Syria. Let me point people to a story that kind of is a more current update on natural disaster. Salvation Army, Convoy of Hope, and the Billy Graham group has partnered. They are the ones that are on the ground in Colorado helping with the flood victims. Folks, feel free to go to the globaldispatch.com, click the religion button, you'll catch the stories. The situation in Colorado really has completely gone unnoticed by the media. We have thousands of people that have been displaced by the flooding there and the crisis there, and tons of work. So please continue to lift them up in prayer and pray for these organizations that they get the resources that they need. So with that, I think we're ready to transition to Mr. McAdams. How are you doing this morning, sir?
Good to be with you. Hi.
It's so great to have you back. I'm going to turn it over to Bob. He's going to lead us through an update on Syria and try to navigate the chaos that is the headlines.
Yes.
Hey, Daniel. Thanks for joining us this morning. I know you're really busy this weekend. You got some important work going on up in Virginia.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, the Syria situation is so incredibly fluid, and I can't even flick on my computer without finding out new information, and it's also very convoluted, going in every possible direction. You got Putin, the peacemaker. You got the contradicting use of, who did chemical weapons, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, who's the bigger neocon, John McCain or John Kerry. Right now, what I'd like you to start out with is just give me your summary assessment on what we know so far.
Sure. Well, as everyone knows, there was the agreement that was made a couple of weeks ago that Syria would join the UN a ban on chemical weapons, would disclose all of its chemical weapons, and they would begin being destroyed, and theoretically would be destroyed within a year, although that's probably technically impossible. This was a deal that came, as you know, on the eve of President Obama's volley of missiles over the bow of Syria that rapidly expanded into something that was much more designed to degrade the regime's ability to conduct war, i.e. a regime change volley of missiles, which, as we know, these are 1,000-pound Tomahawk missiles. They most certainly would kill many more innocent civilians than this so-called chemical attack on August 21st. Even if the regime had done the attack, the U.S. probably would have killed more people with a Tomahawk missile as revenge for the attack. So here we are now. Syria has delivered its list of chemical weapons to the UN on time, as it said.
Sure did. Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. and Russia are now wrangling over what kind of UN Security Council resolution will be introduced in the UN.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Syria did deliver its chemical arsenal list to the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, ahead of schedule, by the way. Let me ask you about Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad. They're not necessarily the nicest guys on the planet. What do you think is the proper way for us to be dealing with them?
Well, of course, as you say, they're not the nicest people on the planet. They're politicians. So politicians everywhere there's a problem with. But I think the U.S. should deal with them as realists, It should look out for America's interests. And look at how silly and childish the U.S. looks after Putin, regardless of how one may consider him, wrote a fairly considerate, interesting article in the New York Times where he chided us a bit on Obama's mention of American exceptionalism, but overall it was a reasoned tone. And look how the neocons in the U.S. went completely nuts about it. McCain had to have his say in Pravda, and the House Armed Services Committee Chairman Buck McEwen did his piece in the Moscow Times, saying how horrible Russia was, and it's like they haven't opened a book on Russia since 1953 or something. It's to them it's still the Soviet Union. People are still being carted off to the gulags. And it's just incredible how small-minded these people are, how narrow-minded narrow-minded and how ill-informed they are. Russia's a problem like a country like any other with problems. It's made incredible progress since the end of the Soviet Union, which was a horrible 70-year period, that deeply wounded the country. But to paint it as if it's somehow, Putin is Stalin, is just so absurd. The world must be laughing at how childish, these so-called political leaders of the U.S. are.
Yeah, I have to concur with you. As a matter of fact, my co-host Brandon did a little op-ed on Putin's piece, which pretty much aligns with what you were saying. The UN report on the chemical weapons, it didn't mention Assad. However, that meant nothing to the administration. As a matter of fact, John Kerry said it was definitive. Britain and France jumped on it too. However, Russia's saying they have contradictory evidence, which has yet to be presented, though. Mm-hmm. What do we buy? I mean, what are we supposed to accept?
Sure. Well, the U.S. has yet to present any evidence either.
Absolutely.
They've not presented a shred of evidence. They made their conclusion before they even did an investigation. And if we want to treat it as a case of criminal activity, wouldn't you want to have at least some evidence to be able to convict? And wouldn't you want to take a look at possible motive? It's plain logic. Why? And he may well have done it, but why on earth? If he did, he's a lunatic. Why on earth, just a couple of days after the UN came to investigate sites of other alleged chemical attacks that certainly pointed to the rebels having used them, why would the regime, almost within earshot of these UN inspectors, launch an enormous volley of chemical weapons? It's just so absurd on its face. It's so, the UN did not have any responsibility to show who did it. So they weren't able to make any conclusions. They reached some fairly strange implications based on information they had about rockets and rocket trajectories. And interestingly enough, a so-called human rights NGO, Human Rights Watch, was right there to help the U.S. regime put blame on the Assad regime for the chemical attack. If you notice, they did some sort of a study where they were able to prove that these rockets came from a military facility of the Syrian government. Now, what human rights organization on earth that has any legitimacy at all would be aiding a government which is threatening to attack another government? How is that protecting anyone's human rights? It's just amazing. This goes to show what kinds of organizations most of these NGOs are, that are often paid by governments and probably infiltrated by government intelligence agents to push government propaganda.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very dark chapter in a history that's littered with dark chapters for Human Rights Watch.
All right. Yeah, you're right, Daniel. Let me go back to the good guys versus the bad guys thing. John McCain, of course, disputed IHS Jane's assessment of the composition of the rebels. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, well, I'm familiar with his view on the rebels.
Right. Well, IHS Jane's pretty much came out and said, the vast majority are either Al-Qaeda or Islamic radicals. But John McCain says, nah, that's not right. It's their Free Syrian Army. So what's McCain's game here?
Well, what would give him any credibility to judge anything? The one trip he took over there that was facilitated by some very shady characters, including an individual who was in charge of an organization that pushed the war on Libya, which was a disaster. What gives him any credibility? He went over there and met with a bunch of kidnappers, and another horrible criminals. And according to some recent press reports, he had a wonderful time with them. He wanted to stay overnight, and he was shocked later to find out that these people were actually kidnappers and creeps. So his own trip demonstrated the impossibility of deciphering between so-called good guys and bad guys in the opposition. So, how does someone like that keep any credibility whatsoever? And as you remember, the scandal over this young woman who had a sort of a cover job at the Institute for the Study of War, which of course is funded by all of the military-industrial complex companies. and she had this other job at a State Department-funded pressure group pressuring for U.S. intervention on Syria, and that was their main evidence, her claims about the Syrian opposition, all of which were certainly should be questioned because of her somewhat less than honest representation of her own self and her own credentials. So on what basis do these people have any authority or any ability to make these claims?
Yeah, none at all. I'm going to go ahead and pass over to Brandon real quick.
I want to just first add more to that for our listeners in case people missed it. When he made the trip to Egypt with Lindsey Graham, remember the first feedback we had from the two of them was, it's much worse than we knew. Obviously, they don't even watch television. To go a step further, Daniel, what I wanted to get to was, let's just play devil's advocate for a moment, and let's just assume that Free Syrian Army people are good guys. Based on the numbers and based on even McCain's assertions, is there even remotely a chance that there's enough of them? The law of numbers, in my opinion, is stacked against them. We can look to Egypt for this, that even if we handed the country over to the FSA, is there any chance that the law of numbers is in their favor so they could even keep control of this country?
No, the only thing they could do is to precipitate a long-term civil war in Syria, where many more hundreds of thousands would die. They don't, according to the very complex mix of different religious and ethnic and cultural backgrounds in Syria, there's no way the FSA would have any legitimacy to run the country. All they could do was violently suppress any opposition, and you would basically have Iraq on steroids, where so many would be killed. And it's so obvious this would happen, you almost have to wonder if that isn't the U.S.'s intent to somehow. I mean, we did it with Iraq and Iran in the 80s during the war. We would help one side until it got too strong, and then we'd help the other side. It's this sort of horrible idea that let's sort of facilitate them killing each other till there's no Syria left. And you almost have to wonder, is that their strategy? Because you're absolutely right. No one with half a brain would think that these people would have any ability to lead the country.
Well, we have to wrap up. Unfortunately, we're against the clock here. But what is it, as far as you can tell, just to give listeners a heads up on what to expect, is the next step for the U.S.? I know Kerry's press conference says one thing. Obama's press conference says something else. I'm not sure I even totally get or could tell someone what I expect the U.S. to do or not do next. In your opinion, what is that?
Well, I think there's been a sea change. I think Russia has emerged, and I think the U.S. has, to a degree, become irrelevant.
Yeah.
It's become irrelevant because its rhetoric is so outrageous, the rest of the world is appalled. So I think the next struggle is over whether this UN Security Council resolution will be filed under Chapter 7, which will allow the use of force, which is what Kerry claims, but Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov says absolutely not. There will be no Chapter 7 resolution on Syria. It would be interesting. I wonder, if anyone would want to bet who comes out on top. My guess is the Russians.
All right. Well, I thank you so much for your time. We do have to wrap up and close. Daniel McAdams, thank you again for being with us. We'll be having you on again. God bless and Godspeed, my friend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Daniel.
All right, well, we're going to be wrapping up the show here. We're going to be plugging next week. We have a very busy schedule as well. We have Dr. Paul St. John is going to be on with us. We're really probably going to be focused on a lot of financial stuff. We're going to be headed into this week. You'll hear a lot of press about the debt crisis, defunding Obamacare. He is a physician, so we'll probably touch on some of that. Then we head into a half hour of pop culture. Bob's going to probably take the day off. He's going to miss out on all sorts of pop culture fun.
Oh, yeah, I'll find something else to do.
Yeah, well, there's Matt Carter. He's a TV guru. And, of course, Mike Smith back on movies. We'll be having that. So, theGlobalDispatch.com. Check it all out. Jake, anything you want to say?
No, I'm good.
All right. Well, God bless. Have a great week, folks. And we'll see you next Saturday.
Thanks for joining us.
I'm the street lights that guide you home. I'll be the GPS when you've lost your phone. I'll be the song that's rocking in